Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Book 3, Chapter 1.
Having now taken a view and inquired into the causes that have ruined nations that have been great and wealthy from the earliest to the present time, having also inquired into the causes that naturally will operate where those did not, and that would, at a later period, have produced the same effect. It is now the business to examine how far and in what way the result of the inquiry applies to the British Empire. The power and wealth of Britain, according to the definition given at the beginning of this work, are founded not on conquests, extent of territory, superior population, or a more favorable soil or climate, or even in bravery, for in those it is but on a par with other nations. The only natural advantages of Britain are its insular situation and the disposition of the people, and the excellent form of its government. From the two first have arisen that good government, commerce, and industry, and on those have arisen again a great naval power and an uncommon degree of wealth. In arms, it does not appear that England is so powerful by land, in proportion as in former times. Her power must then be considered as a naval power, and that founded principally on commerce. As such, then, we have only to examine the foundation on which she stands, and find in what she is vulnerable. We must first begin with the interior situation, to follow the same order that has been attended to in the rest of the work. Changes of manners, habits of education, and the natural effects of luxury are as likely to operate on the British Empire as on some others which they have destroyed. From the unequal division of property, there is perhaps less danger, but from the employment of capital, there is more than almost in any other nation. From the abuses of law and public institutions and l'esprit du corps, we run a very great risk, more indeed than under an arbitrary government or even a republic. These last are the dangers that most seriously threaten a nation living under a mixed government. As to the produce of the soil becoming unequal to the maintenance of a people addicted to luxurious habits, we have much also to fear from that. The operation is begun, and its effects will soon be most serious. They are already felt and very visible. From taxation, unproductive and idle people, we have more to fear than most nations, and from an alteration in the manner of thinking and persons and property leaving the nation, we have as much as any other nation, according to the degree of wealth that we possess. So that, upon the whole, the interior causes of decline are such as it is extremely necessary to guard against in the most attentive manner. In respect to the exterior causes, we are exempt entirely from some, from others we are not, and in one case we have exterior causes for hope that no nation ever yet had. The advancement of other nations, their enmity and envy, are full as likely to operate against this nation as against any other that ever existed. But as we owe none of our superiority to geographical situation, like the Greek islands, the delta of Egypt, and borders of the Mediterranean Sea, we run no risk of any discovery in geography or in navigation, operating much to our disadvantage. We are not so far advanced before other nations in arts as to have any great reason to dread that their advancement will be our ruin. But still we must allow that a number of external causes may combine to bring us to their level, when the effects of our present wealth may soon operate in reducing us under it. Since then, commerce is the foundation of our wealth, and since our power, which is naval, is built upon commerce, let us begin with taking a view of its present situation. The increase of the trade of Britain to foreign parts within these last 15 years, though a very natural effect of the causes that have operated during that period, is not itself a natural increase, because the causes that produced it are uncommon, temporary, and unnatural. The East and West India trades have been both lost to France and Holland. The French, before the Revolution, had a greater share of the West India trade than ever we had, and they could undersell us in foreign markets. The Dutch and French together had a very great share of the commerce of the East. This partly accounts for the rapid increase of English commerce since they lost theirs. Besides, the French nation itself, which formerly consumed scarcely any English manufactures, and supplied Germany and many parts of Europe with its own, has been employed for several years in consuming its manufactured stock, eating up its capital, and ruining its own manufactories, so that France itself, Germany, and a great portion of the continent have been obliged to apply to Britain both for manufactures and colonial produce, as well as for the goods that come from India. Add to this that capital on the continent of Europe has suffered an unexampled diminution from a variety of causes. A great part has been consumed in France, and in all the countries into which her armies have penetrated, particularly in Holland, and that confidence, which serves in place of capital, has been impaired in all countries and ruined in many. It has already been shown that the want of capital prevents a poor nation from supplying itself, and furnishes a rich one with the means of supplying it, and, as it were, extorting usury from it by giving credit. The misfortunes of the continent had by this means, all of them, a direct tendency to advance the commercial prosperity of England. But still the matter does not rest even here, for the real capital that fled from the continent of Europe has, in part, taken refuge in England. We have risen, for the moment, by their depression, and though the advantage will be of some duration, yet we ought not to consider it as permanent. Those causes have operated, as indeed might be expected, in a most powerful manner, but that operation has already begun to cease. In such uncommon and unexampled circumstances as the present, it is impossible to foresee what may happen, yet it is scarcely possible to suppose things will remain as they are. Terror and alarm are too painful to continue their action long on the human mind, and even if the cause were not diminished, the effect would become less violent with time and custom. Again, we are not to suppose that such times as those of 1793 and 1794 are ever to return. Therefore, the alarm will be diminished, new capital will rise up, and, as security of private property is now understood to be the basis of all wealth and prosperity, confidence will be restored by degrees. The increase of trade is not then to be expected from the same causes that have of late operated with so rapid and powerful an effect. On the contrary, they may be expected so far to cease as to occasion a diminution of our exports. This will, however, be counteracted by some circumstances, while others will tend to augment the violence of its effects. The trade with the American states and with Russia increase from no temporary or fallacious cause. In the former country, population very rapidly increases, and in the latter, wealth and civilization, which have a similar effect upon the wants of a nation. These are in favor of a manufacturing country like England. These two are not only, then, permanent, but augmenting causes for our commerce. They are causes that augment rapidly and may, with proper care, be carried to a great extent. The superiority in the West India trade is so far of a permanent nature that France will never again be a formidable rival there. St. Domingo is not only lost, but probably lost forever, while it is expected that Britain may retain her islands. This trade, then, may be set down as permanent. That is to say, that there does not seem to be any immediate cause for its decline, and the government of this country is sufficiently aware of consequences not to neglect taking every precaution possible. The East India trade does not indeed appear equally secure. There we are powerfully rivaled by the Americans and the merchants of other countries. But on the other hand, the demand for the produce of Asia is augmenting rapidly all over the continent of Europe, so that perhaps we may be able to maintain our ground, even though other nations regain part of the trade they have lost. To remain, then, in the situation in which we are, with respect to foreign trade, we must exert ourselves. Those external causes that have forced trade upon us for these last 15 years being but of a temporary nature. In order to be more sensible of this necessity, let us consider a few other circumstances. The wealth of England, which was the envy of Europe, even previous to the American War, in which we stood single-handed and alone, having the three most powerful maritime nations against us and none to take our part, has now become more conspicuous and much more likely to excite envy. Not only the situation of Britain is much more exalted, but the other nations feel a comparison that is infinitely more humiliating. Add to this that old attachments and a regard to the laws of nations and to a balance of power in Europe are much enfeebled, or rather nearly done away. Britain has alone, for some time, stood forward to resist the innovations and power of France, and, after having at first subsidized every nation that would fight in the common cause, it has alone maintained the common right itself, thereby adding a double humiliation to those who wanted means of assisting or whose courage had failed. France, with all its acquisition of territory and alliance, with all that influence over neutral nations, which terror of its arms inspires, will never cease to combat the prosperity of England. Some other nations, through envy or shame, stimulated by a hope of partaking in the wealth that England loses, will either sit passive or assist. The East India trade is that which excites the greatest portion of envy, and it will be difficult to resist its effects. This superior degree of envy is occasioned by three principal causes: the splendid establishments of the East India Company, its fleets, and the fact that it is the greatest commercial company that does now, or ever did, exist, constitute the first cause, not only for envy, but for a wish to participate in the trade. The second cause arises from the extent of our possessions, the immensity of the territorial revenues, and the evident injustice of a company of merchants becoming sovereigns, and holding the ancient princes of the East and the successors of the great Mogul as tributary vassals. It is in vain that we say the people are happier than they were before we did them the honor to become their masters. Whether this is true or not, there is no means of proving it. Besides, there can be no right established by London merchants to force the inhabitants of Hindostan to become happy, whether they will or not. The same pretense has been used by the French in subduing Flanders and Brabant, in governing Holland and Switzerland, but they have not been able to obtain credit. The regular governments who partitioned Poland have pretended the same thing, and our slave merchants and planters give very positive assurances that the Negroes toiling on the West India plantations are much happier than they were in their own country. Yet, in defiance of all this cloud of witnesses, there is something in the human breast that resists and rejects such evidence. Evidence doubtful, on account of the quarter from whence it comes and the interests of the witnesses, as well as contrary to the natural feelings of beings endowed with the power of reason, at variance also with an opinion of a very ancient origin, that coercion and force are enemies to enjoyment. In defiance, then, of our assertions, the other nations of Europe will and do view this acquired territory with anger as well as envy. And though it is true that, out of the immense revenues that arise to the company, they divide little profit, though their debts are annually augmenting, yet individual Englishmen, it must be admitted, bring home great fortunes. This fact is not to be denied, and is so much the worse, that though a government even of merchants may be supposed to obtain revenues fairly, individuals who rapidly acquire great wealth are always supposed to do it by extortion or unfair means. The third cause for envy is of great antiquity. The commerce of the East, from the earliest ages, has been that which has enriched all the nations that ever possessed it, and, consequently, has been a perpetual cause of envy and contention, as we have already seen in its proper place. For all those reasons, not one of which we can remove entirely, the East India trade is a particular object of envy, and unless great care is taken, will entail the same danger on this country as it has on all those that ever possessed it. Tyre and Sidon in Syria, Alexandria in Egypt, Venice, Genoa, the Hanse towns, and Portugal have all been razed and ruined by this trade, which seems to have been the cradle and the grave of most of those nations that have become rich and powerful by the means of commerce. Our West India wealth, though derived from a source still more, or at least equally, impure, and though not inferior in amount, is, for several reasons, not the cause of so much envy. It is not confined to a company, and therefore the splendor and ostentation that, in the case of the Asiatic trade, occasion envy do not exist in that to the American islands. Our monopoly is by no means so complete, which has a double effect in our favor, for besides preventing others from envying us so much, it prevents them from condemning us so severely. The same nations that see in its full force the injustice of subjecting the inhabitants of the East in their own country, in a way that, at the worst, is not very rigorous, join cordially in robbing Africa of its inhabitants to make them slaves in America, in a way that at the best is very rigorous. Such are the baneful effects of sordid interest acting on the mind of man. But our business is not here to investigate opinions, but their result. And in the present instance, we find that to admit participation in criminality is the only way to avoid envy and offense. The third cause for envy is likewise wanting. The commerce with the West Indies is but of a recent date, and no nation has ever owed its greatness or decline to that single source. It is not like the Asiatic trade, a sort of hereditary cause of quarrel, a species of heirloom, entailing upon the possessor the envy and enmity of all other nations. The envy occasioned by the West India trade is farther diminished by the circumstance that the plantations have been raised with the money of the persons by whom they are possessed, and that if they had no original right to the soil in its barren state, the cultivation at least is owing to their capital and industry. The most solid and secure portion of our trade is that which consists of our manufactures at home. In those, though we excite envy, we excite no other of the hateful passions. Emulation is natural, and admiration is unavoidable on seeing the vast progress that arts and industry have made in this country, so that England is absolutely considered as the first country in the world for manufactures. This cause of greatness and wealth operates in a more uniform and durable manner, though, like others, it has its bounds, yet the nature of them is not easily ascertained. In this, there are two things essential: the procuring a market and the means of supplying it. We have always yet found the means of supplying every market we have got, but we have not always been able to extend our market so much as it might have been wished. America and Russia offer new markets, as has already been observed, but to extend our old markets, we must either reduce the price, improve the quality, or extend the credit, and invention is the only means by which these things can be done. And there is no possibility of knowing where to set bounds to invention, aided by capital and the division of labor. We are, however, not to forget that priority in point of time being one of the causes of a nation's rise, and being of a nature to be destroyed in the course of years, the superiority we enjoy may leave us, as it did other nations in former times. When a country produces the raw material, and labor is cheap, and the art established, we might suppose the superiority secure, but it is not. The cotton trade was first established in the East Indies, where the material grows, where the labor is not a tenth of the price that it is in England, and the quality of the manufactured article is good. Yet machinery and capital have transplanted it to England. But the same machinery may give a superiority, or at least an equality, to some other country. It is, therefore, our business to persevere in encouraging invention by the means that have hitherto been found so successful. The most necessary thing for our commerce is the support of mercantile credit, without which it is in vain to expect that trade will be carried on to any great amount. In 1772, when a great failure occasioned want of confidence, the exports of the country fell off above 3 millions, but its imports fell off very little. In 1793, when the internal credit of the mercantile people was staggered, precisely the same effect was produced. These are the only two instances of individual credit being staggered to such a degree as to prevent mercantile men from putting confidence in each other. And they are the only two instances of any very great falling off in the exports in 1 year, except during the American War, when the chief branches of trade in the country were cut off or diminished. The falling off in exports in 1803, which was very great indeed, being no less than 1/3 of the whole, was not occasioned by the same cause, but appears to have been owing to 3 others of a different nature. First, the French had actually shut us out from a great extent of coast, and this occasioned a diminution of exports, which will in part be done away when new channels of conveyance are found out. It will nevertheless operate in causing some diminution, as circuitous channels render goods more difficult to be introduced, and consequently dearer to the consumers. The second cause appears to have been the uncertainty of our merchants where to send the goods, and who to trust, as the fear of the extension of French power took away confidence, and produced a sort of irresolution, which is always hurtful to business. The third cause of the diminution of trade, no doubt, arose from the cessation of that alarm about property, that has been described as having occasioned so much to be sent from the continent to England. In other words, it is the return of the pendulum which had vibrated through a temporary impulse beyond the natural perpendicular. Had there been no revolution in France, and had it not been conducted on the principles it was, our trade could not have augmented so fast as it did. But a falling off of 15 millions in 1 year is too much to be ascribed to that cause alone. An examination of the branches that did fall off will elucidate this. The commerce with the United States of America is one of those that has fallen off, and is the only one that does not appear to be directly connected with these causes. There are some reasons, however, for thinking that it had an indirect connection with them. Whatever interrupts our connection with the continent of Europe or renders it unsafe has in some degree the same effect with a stagnation of credit at home. This has taken place, and as it of course affected every branch of trade, that with America felt the blow amongst the rest, and indeed more than in proportion. For as there is no course of exchange with any town in America, and as the credits there are long, the exportation to that country suffers in a particular manner when there is any heaviness in the money market here. Thus it was that, in 1772, the American exports suffered a diminution of 2 millions from the stagnation, and, in 1793, of rather more than 500,000. In the former case, the American trade seems alone almost to have suffered, and even in the latter case, it fell off more than in its just proportion. It has been observed that the improving our manufactures at home is the most secure support of our foreign trade, which chiefly depends on superior skill, industry, and invention, the wages of labor being greatly against us. We shall consider by what stability of tenure we hold that advantage. The nation or individual that proceeds first in improvement is always uncertain how much farther it can be carried. Those who follow, on the contrary, know what can be done, and therefore act with certainty and confidence. As to individuals, those who are the foremost in improvement have great difficulties to encounter. They seldom can procure the pecuniary aid necessary, and always do so with great difficulty, whereas those who copy without half their merit, or perhaps without any merit at all, meet with support from every quarter. From this it is very evident that the nation the farthest advanced in invention has only to remain stationary a few years, and it will soon be overtaken and perhaps surpassed. Holland, Flanders, and France were all originally superior in the arts of manufacturing most goods to England, and indeed, it is no great length of time since we obtained the superiority over Holland in several articles of importance, and in particular where machinery was wanting. If it were necessary, it would not be difficult to give examples, to show with what eagerness those who imported inventions were taken by the hand on the bare probability of success, while the inventors of machines and of methods of manufacturing entirely new and of still more importance were left to grope their way, and until crowned with success, rather considered as objects of pity than of praise or admiration. It is not then altogether by a sure or lasting tenure that we hold this superiority of manufactures. We have examined several other sources of wealth, and the general conclusion is that without care and attention, this nation cannot be expected long to maintain its superiority over others in the degree it at present enjoys. The American market and the Russian, in a smaller degree, however, hold out a prospect of increased commerce to us from external causes that we cannot flatter ourselves with in the internal ones. It is to those we must look, and to those only, for the extension of the sale of our manufactures. But even in this case, we must use efforts, for it is very seldom that a good end is effected by accident, or without a view towards its accomplishment. Having now taken a view of the situation of this country, and seen that, though it is not likely to be deprived of its commerce by conquest, like Babylon, Tyre, or Alexandria, or by a new discovery in geography and the art of navigation, like Venice and Genoa, though indeed it has no great appearance of sharing the fate of Spain, Portugal, or Holland, yet there are other causes that may stop its career. If it is exempt from the dangers they labored under, it is subject to others from which they were free. We have already examined the effect of taxes and national debt on the industry of a country, even whilst augmenting in wealth. But we have not examined what that effect will be when a country comes to be on a level with other nations that do not labor under the same burthens. There is no possibility of standing long still with a burthen on the shoulders. It must either be thrown off or it will become a cause of decline. Let us endeavor to point out methods by which that may be averted, or at least procrastinated. In doing this, we are either exposing our ignorance and presumption or doing a signal service to our country. The load must be taken off, or it will crush the bearer. But how this is to be done is the difficulty. If our debt is paid off, the capital will go to other nations, for it will not find employment amongst ourselves, and this will reduce the nation and raise others. If it continues, we sink under it, and if we break faith with the creditors, it destroys confidence forever. We can no longer give law, by means of our capital, to the markets in other nations, and we probably overturn the government of our own. Amongst the exterior causes of decline that are general, none applies so completely to Great Britain as that of the envy and enmity occasioned by the possession of colonies we have settled or countries we have conquered. The wealth of Britain and its power arise from agriculture, manufactures, commerce, colonies, and conquests. The envy they excite is not, however, in proportion to the wealth that arises from them, but rather to the right we have to possess them, and the consequent right that others have to contest the possession. Improved agriculture has never been a source of enmity amongst civilized nations, though it has been an object of conquest when an opportunity presented itself. Manufactures, the great source of our wealth, are, in a certain degree, beyond the reach of our enemies. Our greatest consumption for them is amongst ourselves, and if we did not export to any part of the world, except enough to procure materials, we should enjoy nearly all that we now do. Our wealth would not be very materially diminished, though our naval strength would. The means of destroying our manufactures is not then very easily to be found. The commerce with other nations, our enemies or rivals, have a more effectual means of diminishing by the laying on duties on our manufactures and augmenting those duties when the goods happen to be carried in English vessels. But still, the advantage we enjoy in this competition is great. Not so with our colonies and conquests. The whole imports from the East Indies, from 1700 to the present day, have only amounted to £165 million, and our exports during the same period to £83 million, while our total exports have amounted to £1,486,000 during the same period. There would be much affectation and little accuracy in attempting to make anything like a strict comparison between the relative proportions of the wealth procured by general trade and that procured by trade with India. The exports amount to about 1/19th part of the whole, and perhaps, as they are manufactured goods, to about 1/10th part of the whole manufactures of the country exported. But the manufactures exported are not equal to 1/3 part of those consumed at home, so that not above 1/30th part of our manufacturers are maintained by the trade to India. In 1793, when the charter of the company was renewed, the India budget stated the private fortunes acquired and brought home at 1 million annually. That has probably increased since then, but it was at that time greater than it had been before. If, then, we take the annual arrival, since the year 1765, at 1 million, it will make 40 millions, which, compared with the balance of trade during that period, amounts to about 1/6 part of the balance supposed to come into the country. How much of our national debt might be set down to the account of India is another question. By debt contracted and interest of debt paid during the same period, we have disbursed the sum of £1,100,000,000, which is equal to more than 12 times the whole of the property acquired by our India affairs. Supposing the £45 million remitted to be all gain, together with 1/2 of the £83 million, which surely is allowing the gain at the highest rate for both. Supposing, then, that the wars that India has occasioned have cost, or the proportion of the debt they have occasioned, 1/6 part of the whole of our debt, and that the profits on goods to India and private fortunes came into the public treasury, there would still have been a great loss to the state, But this has not been the case. The interest of the debt has been levied on the people and will continue to be so till all is paid off, which, according to the plan of the sinking fund, will be in 35 years, so that we shall have about £750 million more to pay, supposing we have peace all that time and continue to possess India. There is something very gloomy in this view of national affairs, and yet there is no apparent method of making it more pleasing. It is, on the contrary, very possible that as Malta, on account of its being supposed the key to India, has cost us £20 million within a few years, that in less than 35 years it may cost us something more, and it is not by any means impossible that before that period we may either lose India or give it away, on either of which suppositions the arithmetical balance of profit and loss will be greatly altered to our farther disadvantage. On the possessions in India, and the complicated manner in which our imports again exported affect the nation, a volume might be written, but it would be to very little purpose in a general inquiry of this sort. It is sufficient to show here that the wealth obtained by that channel is not of great magnitude in comparison either of the wealth acquired by foreign trade or by our industry at home, and that, at the same time, we see that it excites more envy and jealousy than all the rest of the advantages we enjoy put together. Badly as men act in matters of interest, and much as envy blinds them in cases of rivalship, yet still there is a certain degree of justice predominant in the mind that admits the claim of merit and true desert. Every person who has heard the conversation or read the opinions of people in other nations on the wealth and greatness of England will allow that as commercial men and as manufacturers, we are the wonder of the world and excite admiration. But concerning our dominion over India and our plantations in the American islands, foreigners speak very differently. In order to bring down a nation that has risen above its level, there has followed a system of enmity in war and rivalship in peace. The Portuguese seized on a lucky opportunity to undermine and supplant the Venetians and the Genoese, who had long been the envy of all nations, for the wealth they obtained by the monopoly of the trade to India. The Dutch soon rivaled the Portuguese in trade and the Flemings in manufactures, and indeed there is no saying in how great a variety of ways the superiority of a nation may not be pulled down. England, commencing later than any, has now obtained her full share of the commerce of the East and of manufactures, but the nations that envy the wealth of others have always several great advantages. The nation that is highest treads in discovery, invention, etc., a new path, and is never certain how far she can go, nor how to proceed. Those who follow have, in general, but to copy, and in doing that, it is generally pretty easy to improve. At all events, a day must arrive when the nation that is highest, ceasing to proceed, the others must overtake it. As the nation that is farthest advanced is ignorant of the improvements that may be made, it does not feel what it wants, and like a man in full health, will give no encouragement to the physician. The countries that follow behind act differently, and they generally, in order to protect their rising manufactures, impose duties on similar ones imported, thus preventing a competition between old established manufactures and those recently begun. So far as priority of settlement or of invention give a superiority to a nation over others, the equalizing principle acts with a very natural and evident force. But when the manners and modes of thinking of a people have once taken a settled turn, in addition to their proficiency in manufactures, it does not appear easily to be altered. The Germans excelled at working in metals, and possessed most of the arts in a superior degree to any other people in Europe a few centuries ago. In some arts they have been surpassed by the French, in more by the Dutch, and in nearly all by the English. Conquests and colonies are wrested from nations suddenly and by force. Arts and manufactures leave them in time of peace, silently and by degrees, without noise or convulsion. But the consequences are not the less fatal on that account, nor indeed is the effect slower, though more silent. Though colonies or conquests pass away at once, such changes only take place after a long chain of causes have prepared the way for them, whereas manufactures are perpetually emigrating from one country to another. The operation, though slow and silent, is incessant, and the ultimate effect great beyond calculation. A good government and wise laws that protect industry and property and preserve in purity the manners of the people are the most difficult obstacles for a rival nation to overcome. Prosperity, which is founded upon that basis, is of all others the most secure. There are sometimes customs and habits that favor industry, the operation of which is not perceptible to those who wish to imitate and rival successful and wealthy nations. In general, it is not to be expected that the southern nations can come in competition with those living in more northerly climates in those manufactures, where continued or hard labor is necessary. Nature has compensated the inhabitants of such countries for this incapacity by giving them a fine climate and, in general, a fertile soil. And when they do justice to it, they may live affluent and happy. But, since industry and civilization have got into northern countries, it is impossible for the southern ones to rival them in manufactures. It would be impossible for any people living on the banks of the Nile, where the finest linen was once manufactured, to rival the cloths of Cilicia or of Ireland. As well might we think to bring back the commerce with India to Alexandria by the Red Sea. The fine manufactures of India, notwithstanding the materials are all found in the country, the lowness of labor and the antiquity of their establishment are in many cases unable to keep their ground against the invention and industry of Europeans. The art of making porcelain ware, from a want of some of the materials, has not, in every respect, equaled that manufactured in China, but in everything else except material, it excels so much that the trade to that country in that article is entirely over. Many of the finest stuffs are nearly sharing the same fate, and they all probably will do so in time. Those whom we hope to surpass are determined to remain as they are, while Europeans aim at going as far in improvement as the nature of things will allow. But the nations that follow others in arts are not always confined to imitation, though we have seen that even there they have a great advantage. It frequently happens that they get hold of some invention which renders them superior in a particular line to those whom they only intended to imitate. When the superiority of a nation arises from the natural produce of the earth, such as valuable minerals, then it is very difficult for others to rival it with advantage. And it is very unwise of any nation to employ its efforts in rivaling another in an article where nature has given to the other a decided advantage. And it is equally ill-judged of a nation to neglect cultivating the advantages which she enjoys from nature, as they are the most permanent, and their possession the most certain of any she can enjoy. If nations were to consider in what branches of manufacture they are best fitted to excel, it would save much rivalship, misunderstanding, and jealousy, at the same time that it would tend greatly to increase the general aggregate wealth of mankind. It is not to industry and effort alone that mankind owe wealth, but to industry and effort well directed. This is well explained in the excellent inquiry into the causes of the wealth of nations, and it is to be regretted that this truth is not more generally understood, for it would contribute still more to the peace and happiness of mankind than to their commercial wealth. There is not, however, any subject on which nations are so apt to err, and indeed the error is natural enough if the ambition of a rival is not checked by judgment and attention to circumstances. When a nation is particularly successful in one branch of manufacture more than in any other, it is generally because some peculiar circumstances give it an advantage. This ought to operate as a reason for doubting whether it might be prudent to attempt to rival a nation in an object in which it had particular advantages. But quite the contrary is the case. A rival nation aims directly at the thing in which another excels the most, and frequently fails when, in any other object, she might have proved successful. The changes of the taste and manners of mankind, as well as discoveries in arts and science, lay a foundation for political changes. But it is an irregular foundation for change. Its operation is sometimes in favor of and sometimes against the same nation, and it never can be calculated beforehand. As the nations that have improved in manufactures the latest have always carried them to the greatest perfection, it is natural to inquire how this happens. The exertion of the mind and body are both of them greatly augmented by success and diminished by anything of a contrary description. The rising nation has always an increased energy, and that which is about being rivaled a sort of discouragement and dismay. This is one cause, but there are others. So far as methods of working and machinery are connected, the imitating nation has the advantage. It copies the best sort of machine and the best manner of working at once. The workmen have neither an attachment to the old inferior methods, nor do they use old inferior machines to avoid the expense of new ones. In short, they adopt all improvements without much additional expense, and as men's minds are always more occupied in thinking about a new object than an old one, they are even more likely to make improvements. As to difficulties in rivaling a nation in skill, in any mechanical art, there are none. The only difficulties in manufactures are in the inventions and improvements, and those have been overcome by the leading nation, and are no difficulties to that which follows. There are, indeed, some arts which require particular talents and a real exertion of genius, but those are so few in number and have so little connection with the common affairs of mankind or the wealth of nations that they do not deserve to be noticed. There is nothing in the art of weaving or working in metals or in any other material for common use that is of such difficulty, but that any man with a common capacity may do it nearly as well as any other man. The habits and manners of mankind, their disposition to labor, and the nature of the government under which they live may encourage or discourage manufacturing. But both the strength and capacity of any of the natives of Europe, taking them on an average, are fully sufficient to enable them to excel in any work. The British nation has begun to seek for wealth from agriculture. It had long been the mode to pay attention and give the preference to manufactures, but the current is, for the present, set in another direction. Calculation has, till of late, been confined to mercantile men, but after all, they have not carried it to a very great length, and as to their speculative wisdom, it consists chiefly in taking a ready advantage of some immediate object.
Chapter 2.
The importance of education has been already mentioned, as it in general regards all nations, and certainly when we have examples to show what are the lasting and terrible consequences of degradation of national character and manners, it is impossible to pay too strict an attention to that subject. The natural tendency in a nation, while growing richer, to alter its character, owing to the different manner in which the children are educated and brought up, applies particularly to England and to every nation getting rich by trade or manufactures. In another part, it has been observed that where the wealth of a country circulates amongst the laboring classes first, it alters the manner of living more than when it originates with the higher. It produces also a greater change on the education of children. No part of the general inquiry is so particularly applicable to England, in an excessive degree, as that relative to education. In proportion as ignorant people arrive at that sort of affluence which manufactures and trade produce, in that same proportion do they ruin their children. The manners, the nature of the government, and the way of thinking of the people all lead to this in England. And so far as it is possible to observe the effect, it may be said to appear as if it operated with rapidity at the present period. Many volumes have been written on education by the ablest men, but it has already been observed that they have all treated the subject in a manner much too intricate and complex. Fully aware of the importance, they seem to have thought that it could not be treated too much at length or investigated too minutely, and by this means what they have said is little applicable to general purposes. For if to educate a man for common life were a difficult, complicated operation, it would very seldom be performed. The word education itself appears to be misapplied or misunderstood, owing probably to its original construction and use, and no other word having been substituted in its place. By education was meant, in former times, the teaching to read and write, and these accomplishments, which at that time distinguished a gentleman from the lower classes, and by that means education is still considered as only applying to the learning of what is taught at schools or universities. It is principally in this light that those who have written on it have viewed it, though in fact well brought up, bien élevé, comes nearer to the meaning than being well learnt, which is equivalent to well educated. In this, as in every other thing, the end in view should never be forgotten. But, as it happens with respect to the middling and lower orders, it is forgotten so soon as affluence has made a little progress in a country. The education of the higher classes is generally pretty well conducted, and indeed, human beings, when beyond the reach of want, who do not inherit the necessity derived from Adam, of gaining their bread by the sweat of their brows, require much more teaching than others, whose conduct is regulated by necessity, and who have not the means of giving way to the passions that beset human nature. With respect, however, to the higher classes, it is scarcely possible for a government to interfere to much purpose. Those who are possessed of fortune will act according to inclination, and, in respect to this class of society, in England, it is already in less need of reform or interference than any others, while the lower and middling classes require it more. There is no possibility for an ignorant man to become of any importance in this country, even with the aid of wealth and fortune. An immoral character, or a mean, selfish one, has not a much better chance, while by talents and good conduct everything desirable may be obtained. Perhaps nothing further can be done to excite men of rank and fortune to emulation and virtue. With respect to the learned professions, the modes by which students are brought up to them are by no means unexceptionable, but that is not a point of very great national importance. At any rate, it is not the part in which England stands the most in need of attention and interference from the government of the country. The two classes to whom bringing up, as it is generally understood, would apply better than the word education, are the middle rank of society and the lower order of people in trade. The middle rank of society is, in all countries, the most important in point of principles and manners. To keep it pure is always of the highest importance, and it is the most difficult, for there a baneful change is the most apt to take place. Gentlemen of rank in all countries resemble each other very nearly, not, perhaps, in exterior, because that depends on fashion, which is arbitrary, but in mind and manners there is less difference than between men in a second rank of society. The lower orders, so far as they are forced, by necessity to labor, resemble each other also. They are pressed by necessities and passions on one side, and the desire of rest on the other, and a fair allowance being made for variety of climate, of circumstances, and of natural dispositions, there is nothing very different amongst them. What applies with respect to the higher and lower orders does not apply at all to the middling classes, nor even to the most wealthy class of laborers in a manufacturing country. In those we can find no fixed character. It is as variable as the circumstances in which the individuals are placed, and it is there that a government should interfere. It should interfere in guiding the richer classes of working people and the middling ranks in the education of their children and in assisting those of the lower orders who are too much pressed upon by indigence. The end in view in all education is to make the persons, whether men or women, fill their place well and properly in life, and this is only to be done by setting a good example, instilling good principles, accustoming them when young to good habits, and above all, by teaching them how to gain more than they are habituated to spend. It follows from this that industry and a trade are the chief parts of education, that reading and writing are not, being but of a very doubtful utility to the laboring class of society. On this subject, it is absolutely necessary to advert to what Dr. Smith says relative to apprenticeships. The opinion of so great a writer is of too much importance not to be examined and refuted if found wrong. Apprenticeships, or teaching a trade, is the basis of the future happiness and prosperity of the individual in the lower and middle classes. On this subject, however, Mr. Smith says quite the contrary, that the idleness of apprentices is well known, that their inducement to industry is small, and that as to what they have to learn, a few weeks or sometimes a few days would, in most cases, be sufficient. In short, he maintains that they would learn better, be more industrious and useful, if employed on wages, than if bound for a term of years. And finally, that there were no apprentices amongst the ancients. As to there being no apprentices in the ancient world, if that was the case, is no argument with respect to the present state of things, for while most part of working men were slaves, there could not possibly be much occasion for apprentices. But are we quite certain that the freedmen, so often mentioned, were not people who had served apprenticeships? Freedmen are so often mentioned that there must have been probably something else to which they owed their freedom, besides the goodwill or caprice of their masters, particularly as that goodwill must have been exercised to deserving objects, and consequently the sacrifice made in giving liberty was the greater. As men cultivated difficult arts, that is, as luxury increased, it must have become difficult to get labor done by slaves, merely by compulsive means. There must have been bargain and mutual interest settled between the master and the slave, so as to accomplish the end intended. Amongst rewards to a slave, liberty, at a certain period, is not only the greatest, but is the only one that effectually serves the slave. For while he remains the property of a master, his rewards can consist of little else than good treatment, as all property given is liable to be taken back again. Supposing, however, the point yielded, and that there were no apprentices in the early ages, but that the practice originated in the days of ignorance, in the Dark Ages, under the feudal system, together with the invention of corporations and privileged bodies against whose existence the whole set of economists have leagued together, as the Greeks did against Troy, still the obscurity of the origin is no objection. A constitution like that of Britain, for example, is not an invention of antiquity. It took its rise in the Dark Ages and in times of ignorance, but it is not for that the less an object of admiration. Many other examples may be furnished of the admirable things that took rise in the Dark Ages, and amongst them, not the least, is the abolition of slavery itself. Let us, however, examine the effect of apprenticeships in those places where they can be compared with persons brought up entirely free. If there are trades where it is true, as Mr. Smith affirms, that the art of working may be learnt in a few weeks, what are the consequences? At the age of 16 or 17, a boy can get as much money as he will be able to earn at any future time in his life. He will be able to get as much as a man who has a wife and 5 or 6 children to maintain. There will be required a very great share of moderation and wisdom, indeed, under such circumstances, to prevent such a boy from wasting his money in ways that will incapacitate him from living easy when he shall become a father of a family himself, or from idling away the spare time that his gains afford him. He will naturally do part of both, but the way that is generally done is this. Without control from a master and totally independent of parents, who are quite left behind in poverty, not having more to maintain their whole family than the youth himself earns, he despises them, saves a little money at first, and purchases finery. The novelty of dress soon wears off, and the more immediate pleasures of eating, drinking, and keeping company, as it is termed, take the lead. The consequence of the same is idleness and rags. Ashamed to show himself amongst persons of better conduct, the youth changes his place of residence and work. Habit has got hold of him, and labor becomes hateful. A soldier's life appears the best for a youth of such a description, and it is an undoubted fact that, at those places where trades are carried on, that can be learnt in a short time, there are more recruits obtained for the army than in any other districts of equal population. It is also an undoubted fact that in these same districts, the most respectable people bind their sons apprentices, and in doing so, they are guided by experience and affection for their children, not by interested motives. In the other case, again, where a trade is not easily learnt, how is skill to be obtained but by an apprenticeship? The bringing the son up to his father's trade, a practice that prevails in the eastern parts of Asia, is one way. Parental authority needs not the aid of a written indenture. But, where this is not the case, who is to teach a youth, if he is not to be bound for a certain number of years, but to go away as soon as he has learnt a trade? The father, in some cases, may be able to pay for his son learning the trade, and this experiment has sometimes been tried, but generally with very imperfect success. The youth, for the most part in those cases, considers himself as independent of the master, and gives himself very little trouble to learn his business. Where the reward of the master, or rather the remuneration for his pains and trouble, is to arise from the labor of the boy, the master is interested in his learning, and the other feels an obligation, as well as an interest in learning. Though the apprentice is not absolutely paid for what he does, he finds his ease, his importance, and comfort all depend on his proficiency. And with young minds, such motives are much more powerful and act through a better channel than avarice. The power that the legislature gives to a master over his apprentice appears not only to be wise but necessary. And if rewards for earning a trade could be given, in addition to that without infringing on liberty or burthening the state, it would be a great advantage. But learning a trade is not the only advantage of an apprenticeship. A good moral conduct, fidelity, and attention to his duties are all acquired at the same time, or ought to be so, whereas the youth who, at an early age, is left without control is apt to learn just the contrary. Where people have fortune, circumstances give them a control over their children by expectancies, but where there is no fortune and children must provide for themselves, an apprenticeship is a substitute for expectancies, which appears highly necessary. And it is wonderful how so discriminating and profound a man as Dr. Smith could overlook so material a circumstance. It shows how far prejudice and an opinion once adopted will lead men of the first judgment and genius astray. For it is not to be supposed that any person will stand forward of himself to maintain an opinion against which experience speaks so decidedly. To learn a trade and be taught a good moral conduct and attention to one's duty is certainly the essential part of education, both in the lower and middling classes, and that portion of education, which appears to have got an exclusive title to the name, reading and writing, are, with the working classes, a very inferior object. One of the duties of government, then, is to watch over the education of the children of the middling and lower orders, which has a tendency to grow worse as the nation advances in wealth. In England, the pride of the middling classes is to have their children educated at boarding schools, where the business of eating, sleeping, dressing, and exercise is pretty well understood, where the branches of education pretended to be taught are little attended to, writing and some exterior accomplishments of which the father and mother can judge accepted, where moral conduct, the duties in life, and the conduct necessary to be followed are scarcely once thought of. It is true that, till a certain age, it is generally not known for what particular line of life a young man is intended. But there are certain things necessary to every line of life, and those should never be neglected. The habits contracted at schools are very often of a sort never to be got the better of. And how can good habits be contracted when no attention is bestowed on the subject? The consequence of this is that when the good sense of the father or mother, or of the boy himself, does not correct the evil, he is bred up to consider himself as born to be waited on and provided for without any effort of his own. He is led to suppose that he is to indulge in a life similar to that his father leads at home, where a few indulgencies are the natural consequences of age, and the fair returns for a life employed in care and industry. In England, it would be absolutely necessary to make schoolmasters undergo an examination, not only at first and before the school should be licensed, but the boys should be examined twice a year, and the result enregistered, so that the business would really be to learn something, and not merely to spend the time. The small proficiency made in the schools in England and around London in particular is incredible. It is even difficult to conceive how the boys avoid learning a little more than they generally do during 8 or 10 years. The masters pretend, for the most part, to teach boys Latin by way of teaching them English, but without almost ever accomplishing it. In arithmetic, the common rules are taught, but scarcely ever decimal fractions, and almost never bookkeeping, so useful and so easy an art. Writing and spelling are better taught, perhaps, than in any other country, and certainly those are great advantages. But according to the time and money spent, it is the least that can be expected. Here we may remark that those are the only acquirements with the proficiency in which the father and mother are necessarily acquainted. It therefore gives reason for thinking that if the same check were held in other branches of their education, they would be excited to make equal progress. When the time comes that it is fixed on what line of life a young man is to adopt, then there should be schools for different branches, where there should be knowledge taught, analogous to the profession. For the mercantile line, for agriculture, for every line of life, boys should be prepared. And above all, it should never be neglected to instill into them the advantages of attention to industry, to doing their duty, and in every case making themselves worthy of trust. Public examinations, such honors and rewards as would be gratifying, but not expensive for those that excelled, would produce emulation. Though perhaps it is not of very great importance to excel in some of the studies to which a young man applies at school, yet it is of great importance to be taught that habit of application that produces excellence. With regard to the education of the lower classes, it would be no great additional burthen to the nation if there were proper schools established in every parish in the kingdom, at the expense of the public, in order that there might be a proper control over those who teach and over what is taught. Without going so far as to compel people of the lower classes to send their children to school, they might be induced to do it for a short time, and at all events, care should be taken that the teachers were fit for the office they undertake. In no country do the lower classes neglect the care of their children more, or set them a worse example than in England. They are mostly brought up as if the business of eating and drinking were the chief purpose of human existence. They are taught to be difficult to please and to consider as necessary what, in every other nation in Europe, is considered by the same rank of people as superfluous. Although the lower orders have as good a right as the most affluent to indulge in every enjoyment they can afford, yet to teach this to children, without knowing what may be their lot, is doing both them and society an injury. A great number of crimes arise from early indulgence of children, and from neglecting to instill into them those principles which are necessary to make them go through life with credit and contentment. The Spartans used to show their youth slaves or helots in a state of intoxication in order to make them detest the vice of drunkenness. But this was the exhibition of a contemptible and mean person in a disgraceful situation. The effect is very different when children see those they love and respect in this state. It must have the effect of either rendering the parent contemptible or the vice less odious. It perhaps has some effect both ways, but at all events, it must operate as a bad example, and amongst the lower classes, it is a very common one. When a nation becomes the slave of its revenue and sacrifices very thing to that object, abuses that favor revenue are difficult to reform. But surely it would be well to take some mode to prevent the facility with which people get drunk, and the temptation that is laid to do so. The immense number of public houses and the way in which they give credit are undoubtedly, in part, causes of this evil. It would be easy to lessen the number without hurting liberty, and it would be no injustice if publicans were prevented from legal recovery for beer or spirits consumed in their houses, in the same manner that payment cannot be enforced of any person under 21 years of age, unless for necessaries. There could be no hardship in this, and it would produce a great reform in the manners of the lower orders. There are only 3 modes of teaching youth the way to well-doing: by precept, by example, and by habit at an early age. Precept, without example and habit, has but little weight. Yet how can a child have either of these if the parents are encouraged and assisted in living a vicious life? Nations and individuals should guard against those vices to which they find they have a natural disposition, and drinking and gluttony are the vices to which the common people in this country are the most addicted. Whatever other things may be taught, let this truth be instilled into all children brought up to earn their bread, that in proportion to their diligence will be their ease and enjoyment, and that this world is a world of sorrow and grief to the idle and the ignorant. That knowledge does not consist in being able to read books, but in understanding one's business and duty in life, and that industry consists in doing it. Female education in England requires as much reform as that of the other sex, but though the subject is not much less important, it is perhaps still more difficult. It has been remarked by those who have traveled abroad that, in other countries, women are in general not better, but rather worse dressed than men of the same rank. In England it is different, for, at an early age, the women are dressed, both as to style and quality of clothes, far above their rank. This might perhaps not be difficult to account for, but it undoubtedly is a misfortune, and one that is greatly increased by the mode of education and manner of thinking. For the main and indispensable virtue of that amiable sex excepted, for which English women are highly distinguished, perhaps no women in the world are brought up in a more frivolous, unmeaning manner. The French women, with all their vivacity and giddy airs, have more accomplishment, and as they speak their mind pretty plainly, they have, on many occasions, testified surprise to find English ladies who had studied music for years, who could scarcely play a tune, and who, after devoting years to the needle, were incapable of embroidering a pincushion. Novels, a species of light, insipid, and dangerous reading, are the bane of English female education. They teach a sort of false romantic sentiment and withdraw the mind from attention to the duties of life, at a time when it should be taught to learn their high importance. In female education, the government should interfere, for the education of the mother will always have an influence on the education of the son, as her conduct in life must have on that of her husband. As one general observation, relative to the education given at most public schools, it may be observed that whilst much time is taken up in teaching things that can never probably be of great utility, that species of knowledge that does not belong to any particular class, but which is of the utmost importance, is left to chance and to accident. While a boy is tormented with learning a dead language, he is left to glean, as in a barren field, for all those rules of conduct on which the prosperity and happiness of his future life depends. A public education is, in many respects, better than a private one for boys, but in some things it is inferior. Consequently, those who can afford it and wish to give their sons the most complete education try to unite the advantages of both by sending them to a public school under the care of a private tutor. It is not in the power of the middling classes to do this, but modes should be adopted to give the boys, either by books or public lectures, those instructions relative to moral conduct, to prudence, behavior, etc., which a private tutor gives to those under his particular charge. As to female education, it is a difficult subject. One great improvement would, nevertheless, be not to allow above a certain number in any one seminary, to have people of irreproachable conduct over them, and wherever the parents can, to bring them home at the age of 13 or 14. The public education ought certainly to finish at an early age, and in all cases, with respect to females, a private is much preferable to a public education.
This concludes today's reading of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.